So I've been using the M4 iPad Pro nonstop for 2 weeks straight. I've used it to write my newsletter. I've used it to edit B-roll in Final Cut Pro, to create thumbnails in Photoshop, and pretty much everything in between. I even spent a day on the beach with this iPad Pro. And I challenged myself to not use my M3 MacBook Air throughout this 2-week period just to see if I can actually use an iPad Pro instead of my Mac. And well, I wasn't able to do so. A few things went wrong. But don't worry, I'm not going to make a case for why the iPad needs to run macOS, or how the M4 chip is so overpowered and that iPadOS doesn't take full advantage of that. We've been saying that for years. I'm not going to talk about that in this video. Let's start with the number one feature that Apple has been marketing with this new iPad Pro, and that is the design, specifically how thin and light it is. The 13-inch model, which is the one I've been using primarily, is 5.1 millimeters thin. That is the thinnest Apple product ever, dethroning the iPod Nano. That's 30% thinner than the first generation iPad Pro 12.9, and it also weighs just 579 grams, or about the same as a can of soup. But honestly, unless you're holding the M4 iPad Pro in one hand and a previous iPad Pro in the other hand, you're not really going to be able to tell a big difference in the size or the weights in terms of the thickness or the weights. Like, I can tell because I've handled every previous iPad Pro, but unless you've handled every one in the past, you're not going to be able to tell a big difference unless you have them both in your hand at the same time. So really, I see this whole, thinnest Apple product ever as kind of a gimmick on Apple's end. It is technically the thinnest ever, but it's not going to be a huge difference that's going to really blow you away, especially if you have a Magic Keyboard, because once you put your iPad in that Magic Keyboard, you're never going to see how thin it is, and you're never going to feel how light it is. So that kind of, defeats the purpose. But in my opinion, you need the Magic Keyboard to take full advantage of the iPad Pro. So that's why I see this whole thinness, whole design change is not really a huge selling point if you're in the market for an iPad Pro. But we do have a couple of design differences, which is pretty rare for the iPad Pro. Like, we have the typical full screen display that we've had for a while now. We do have a new space black color. We also have a new camera housing on the back, so it's a different design, and it also only has one lens. So we are missing the ultra wide lens from the rear of the previous iPad Pros. And then on the front side, we have a landscape camera now, which leads to better center stage and faster Face ID unlock without, accidentally covering up the camera with your finger, which happened to me all the time on previous iPad Pros. And it's also just more natural to unlock your iPad because you don't have to go like this, to get in frame of that camera that's lopsided on one side of the iPad. But the main difference, aside from the design and the all-powerful M4 chip, which we'll talk about here in a moment, is the all-new Tandem OLED display. And this is a first for Apple, although they did not invent this type of display or this phrase. This is essentially 2 layers of OLED pixels layered on top of each other to create one consistent screen. Now, here's something where a lot of people got confused. Those two OLEDs pushed together are not to make, the pixels pop out of the screen. You're going to have amazing quality. It's still going to be like typical OLED quality, but those 2 layers are pushed together to increase the brightness. And that's why we have amazing brightness on this M4 iPad Pro. It has 1000 nits of peak brightness for standard content and 1600 nits for HDR. So this new Tandem OLED is great for bumping up that brightness while also reducing, power consumption. That's the benefit here of Tandem OLED versus regular OLED. And the big difference here, and this kind of went viral on social media as well, is that in the, dark environments, like if you're in bed or just kind of a shaded environment, you can still see the dark gray backlight of the mini LED. It's not fully black versus the pitch black on the Tandem OLED display, since the pixels are technically turned all the way off. So it's as black as it gets. And this is also the first iPad to offer a Nano-Texture Display, which is the one I've been primarily using for the past 2 weeks. And it's great because you have less reflections, you have less smudging, and it just feels more fluid and more smooth with your finger and your pencil swipe. So your pencil doesn't get caught up on all your oily fingerprints on the screen like what happens on previous iPads. Even on the iPhone, you can feel it sometimes. When you go to scroll, you'll kind of hit a patch of like oil on your screen and it slows you down. But with the new, Nano-Texture Display, it's just so smooth you never hit those greasy patches on your screen. Or maybe just me. Maybe I just need to wash my hands. It also does not feel at all like a paper-like screen protector. I know that was one of the big debates at first, is that this Nano-Texture would feel like the paper-like screen protector when you draw on it, with an Apple Pencil. pencil, but it doesn't feel like that at all. It's a lot less dramatic than the paper-like screen protector, which I had on my previous iPad. I actually like it better on the Nano-Texture because it's smoother and it's also a more subdued sound, and it doesn't feel like it's wrecking my pencil tip. It's yet to be seen if it really is damaging the pencil tip more than usual, but it doesn't seem like it is so far. And honestly, I was on the fence about keeping the Nano-Texture display, but after using it outdoors that day, when I went to the beach, I was sold. I mean, I could see the screen without that sun reflection that just makes me squint every time. I have really sensitive eyes, so when I see that reflection in the screen, it literally makes me squint, and I always have to hold the iPad at an angle to not have the sun, beating right down on the screen. But with this Nano-Texture display, that was not near as big of an issue as I've had in the past. But of course, every good thing has to have a downside, and the downside of the Nano-Texture display is that it's not going to be quite as sharp as the non-Nano-Texture display. Now, you do notice a tiny loss in quality. You can definitely see it because you have that matte, layer over top of the screen. But honestly, it's not super noticeable unless you're really, you just have it in your mind that the quality is going to be worse. I was actually really shocked that it wasn't much worse. Like, I got this just to test because I expected the quality to be really bad compared to the regular, but I've had them side by side. I showed them in my video as well. There's not a huge difference. Like, you can tell when you have them side by side and you're really looking for it, but it's not like it's going to be like LCD, quality. You're still going to have an OLED screen at the end of the day. So it's still going to be a tremendous, quality display. And of course, the other big downside is the fact that you have to get the 1 terabyte model or the 2 terabyte model, which means that you have to spend $2,000 if you want to get a Nano-Texture iPad Pro M4. So for most people, I would say do not get Nano-Texture. It's most likely not worth it unless you are an artist who really likes drawing on the Nano-Texture, or if you're just somebody who's always outdoor, you're always on the go, that's another reason to maybe get Nano-Texture. But I would say for 99% of people, I would just opt for the regular glossy display for this iPad Pro. And while we're talking about the display, I also have to mention that I was very surprised by the speakers in the M4 iPad Pro. I thought for sure that since we got a thinner, setup here with this iPad Pro, I thought it was going to lead to worse quality in terms of the speakers, especially when it comes to the bass. But I was very surprised to hear that the speaker sounded pretty much the same as previous iPad Pros, if not a little bit better. So they sounded great, and you can hear a sample of that here. And as far as the microphones go, we do have 4 studio quality microphones compared to 5 on the previous 2 generations of iPad Pro. So we lost a microphone, probably to save space, but here's how that sounds. So here's what the M4 iPad Pro sounds like from the internal microphone. I'm curious to see if it's going to sound better or worse than the previous generation. Okay, we cannot talk any longer without mentioning the biggest surprise of this new iPad Pro, and that is the M4 chip. So this is the first Apple product to get M4, which is built on 2nd generation 3nm technology that's not only faster, but also more power efficient. And I have the 1 terabyte model, so this is going to have a 10-core CPU, a 10-core GPU, and 16 gigs of RAM. But most importantly, every model of the M4 iPad Pro has hardware accelerated ray tracing, and this opens up the iPad to the world of AAA games like Assassin's Creed Mirage. So if you're a gamer, the M4 iPad Pro will be the iPad to get. And with my 16 gigs of RAM on my 1 terabyte model, I've noticed that Stage Manager is as fluid as ever. It seems even more smooth than the 8 gig models. But I do wish that I could use my Apple Pencil to adjust the sizing and make the swiping gestures that you can do with your finger. That's one of the big limitations and the big downside of using the Apple Pencil is that you can't do a lot of things you can do with your finger. And in terms of other use cases where I really noticed the M4 shine, I noticed this especially in two areas, and that is with Photoshop, specifically generative fill. So the AI features in Photoshop are a lot faster at rendering and just loading the content than on my M1 and presumably the M2 iPad Pro as well. And then also with Lightroom, when I apply things, when I use my pencil to use it as a brush on my photo, there's no lag at all, which is amazing. So that's where the M4 really shines. Also with Final Cut Pro and exporting videos, it is much faster than my M1. But if you're mainly getting this iPad to use as a media consumption device, if you're just browsing the web, browsing social media, tracking your to-do list and reading emails and replying to emails, you're not going to really be able to tell a big difference in terms of day-to-day performance compared to the M1 or M2 iPad Pros. But I will say, when it comes to streaming video, this is also the first iPad with an AV1 decode engine, which means that you're going to have faster and smoother streaming in applications like YouTube, Netflix, Instagram, and almost every other social media application. They all use the AV1 format, so it's going to be a bit smoother and also eat up less battery life. And I wanted to expand on that battery life a little bit because Apple rates the iPad Pro for 10 hours of web browsing, but I've noticed slightly better battery life on M4 compared to the M1 where I came from. Now, what's interesting here is that we do have the battery section for the first time on an iPad, and we have the 80% limit as well, which I'm using to prolong my battery's capacity. That's where the battery only charges up to 80% and not 100%. So I don't even have the full 100%, and my battery still lasts all day easily on this iPad Pro. Now, it could be because it's a new battery, but it feels really, really good so far. And what's really interesting as well is that the M4 battery is smaller than the M1 and M2 batteries. I did also want to elaborate on the cameras as well, because we do have the front-facing landscape camera, which is nice, but I think the biggest advantage here is with the rear-facing camera, because document scanning gets even better with the M4 iPad Pro and that adaptive True Tone flash, which Apple now uses in tandem with AI to remove shadows from documents, and it was noticeable pretty much right away. I showed this in multiple videos, but you can see that the shadows get removed from these documents. It does have a little bit of a kind of a blank area there, so it's not perfect, but it is better than what we had previously. Now, I did also want to talk about the accessories, because this was a more substantial difference and a more substantial upgrade than I think anybody expected. So we have the new Magic Keyboard, which looks far more premium because it has aluminum now all over it, and we also have a function row that makes a big difference. So we have the volume, the brightness, we have a lock unlock button, which is nice. Basically just a bunch of function keys so that you don't need to move your hands away from the actual keyboard to perform certain actions. Like you don't need to lock the iPad anymore. You don't need to turn up or down the iPad anymore. Those are all on the keyboard now. Also, the keys stick out a tad bit more. The trackpad is a little bit bigger and it has haptic feedback now that feels better and also not nearly as loud when clicking versus the old Magic Keyboard. And the best part is it's still $349, the same price as the previous generation Magic Keyboard. Now, the big downside is that this thing is still really hard to open with one hand. I've never been able to perfect it, and it seems worse to me, honestly, on this new Magic Keyboard. It's even harder to open with one hand. But the two other issues I have with the Magic Keyboard are, number one, there's no little pocket or no little slot to put the Apple Pencil so it doesn't fall out. And number two, these things just get really dirty really easily. So there are a few downsides to the Magic Keyboard, but I do not think there are any downsides to the new Apple Pencil Pro, which was also just introduced at the same $129 price tag, despite having several new features, including Find My support built in, so you can locate the Apple Pencil if you lose it. We have haptic feedback, which feels amazing when you're using the Apple Pencil. We have a artificial drop shadow, so you can actually see like an artificial drop shadow underneath of your tool while you're hovering over the screen. You have barrel roll, which allows you to see the orientation before you touch down on the screen, and also the squeeze feature where you can squeeze it anywhere on the screen and you'll get a little control panel where you can access your tools quick and easily. I still stand by the fact that I think the Apple Pencil is a must-have no matter what you do on the iPad Pro. So my challenge with this M4 iPad Pro was to use it instead of my MacBook Air for 2 straight weeks. And Well, I didn't make it. But first, let me just say that this is the closest I've ever been to not needing my MacBook and only using my iPad Pro. Like in the past, applications like Photoshop, Lightroom, even Final Cut Pro were just not good at all on the iPad. I was so much more efficient on the computer than on the iPad, but this time around, it was the closest I've ever been because I was able to use all three proficiently on the iPad Pro, which really surprised me. And I did also have a few other observations as well. And one of the main ones that surprised me was that, I'm not a fan of Stage Manager on macOS, but I love it on iPadOS. I use it every day. However, I do wish, again, that we could use the Apple Pencil to adjust the sizing and perform these swiping gestures. But other than that, Stage Manager works great, especially on the 13-inch model. And also the iPad is just great for being more compact. I noticed that I get distracted less easily on the iPad, which surprised me versus the MacBook. And just other small things like being able to move rooms easier. It's more flexible with the iPad. And strangely, I don't worry about battery life as much with the iPad as I do my MacBook. I don't know why, the MacBook gets better battery life than the iPad, but for some reason, instinctively, I just don't think about it as much when using the iPad, which is a nice feeling. But again, there are some reasons why I was not able to use the iPad only over these past couple of weeks. And the first reason is because audio editing with Audacity is impossible on the iPad. And I also use another audio editing application on macOS, and those are only available on macOS. There are no audio editing applications on the iPad that work for the way that I edit my audio. So that was a huge downside. And the other big downside was the fact that I was not able to use my Final Cut Pro plugins. So Final Cut Pro on the iPad is not as complex as it is on desktop, which meant I was not able to import my third-party plugins that I rely on in my videos for my video projects. And that's why I said earlier that I was only able to edit B-roll in the Final Cut Pro for iPad application. And if you notice, those two issues I had are both related to application support. So my main issue with the iPad, it seems, is application support. Like to me, file system, yes, the file system can be improved, but I never had a major issue with files. So to me, the bigger miss with iPadOS is just simply application support. Like if we can run some type of, macOS applications, maybe like a ported version of macOS applications, that would be great. I don't want macOS on the iPad. I just want ported applications to the iPad, kind of like what we saw with Lightroom, with Photoshop, with Final Cut Pro. If we could get that for, some lesser known applications, but also popular, like Audacity, for example, or just importing or just adding features to Final Cut Pro, like being able to get my third-party plugins available in there. Those are the things that would keep me on the iPad primarily, and where I would not need my, MacBook at all. In theory. So I think the bigger miss is with application support, not necessarily the file system or even just running a full macOS on the iPad. So if you're thinking about buying an M4 iPad Pro, if it's even in your budget, if you're even considering it, I do think it is worth upgrading even from an M1 or M2 iPad Pro. That's my hot take. I think there are enough differences to warrant the upgrade from an M1 or M2 iPad Pro. Because if you break it down, you can sell your iPad Pro and it's going to be around $500 to $800 to upgrade, maybe even less than $500, depending on whether you trade it into Apple or sell it on eBay. And if you keep this M4 iPad Pro for 4 years, that's around $125 to $200 a year. That is well worth it if you use this iPad for work, or if you could just comfortably afford, the best tablet that Apple has to offer. It does not get any better than this iPad Pro. And to me, if I'm paying, $100 a year for it, that is well worth it for me to get things done faster and more efficiently, especially when I'm on the go. So I hope you enjoyed this review on the M4 iPad Pro. If you did, I would appreciate if you give it a thumbs up. Also, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on future iPad reviews and coverage. But anyways, guys, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you soon.